Greetings, warriors and dreamers. Welcome to the realms of sleep, where tonight we journey through the epic world of God of War. I am your guide through the 9 realms, where ancient gods whisper their secrets and mythic landscapes unfold before us. From the frost-covered mountains of Midgard to the golden halls of Asgard, these tales of gods and giants will carry you into peaceful slumber. Lay down your weapons, rest your weary head, and allow the legends of these powerful beings to become the landscape of your dreams. The battles have been fought, and now is the time for rest. So close your eyes, brave one. Let the fire of the hearth warm you as we begin our journey through realms both wondrous and dangerous. The last crimson rays of sunset bled from the ancient forests of Vanaheim as Freya made her way along the forgotten path. Moss-covered stones marked the trail that few now remembered, winding between colossal trees whose branches created a cathedral-like canopy overhead. Her steps were deliberate yet light, barely disturbing the carpet of fallen leaves that softened the forest floor. Despite her unhurried pace, purpose guided each movement. She had been called back to this place after too long an absence. The Witch of the Woods carried nothing but a small pouch of herbs at her belt and the clothes upon her back, a simple dress of deep green embroidered with gold thread that caught what little light filtered through the forest canopy. She had shed her armor and weapons, leaving behind the trappings of the warrior she had become in her years of exile. Tonight required something different, something she had almost forgotten. Vulnerability. As twilight deepened, the forest changed around her. Night-blooming flowers unfurled delicate petals, releasing subtle fragrances that stirred ancient memories. Luminescent fungi adorned fallen logs like strings of ethereal lanterns, casting a spectral blue-green glow that illuminated her path, where the trees grew densest. Freya paused occasionally, her fingers brushing against moss-covered trunks or trailing through ferns that whispered against her skin, reacquainting herself with a homeland that had once known her touch intimately. The land remembers, she murmured to herself, voice barely audible above the gentle symphony of night creatures beginning their evening songs. She could feel it, the subtle shift in the forest's energy as it recognized her presence. No longer queen, no longer goddess in name, yet still connected to the land through bonds forged in the realm's deepest magic. Small woodland creatures emerged from hiding to observe her passage. Curious squirrels with eyes like polished obsidian, a fox whose russet coat appeared almost ethereal in the deepening twilight, silent owls watching from overhead branches with ancient wisdom in their unblinking gaze. None fled from her approach. Instead, they seemed to acknowledge her with the quiet reverence due a returning daughter of the Vanir. A nightingale alighted on a branch near her path, its song more complex and melodious than those of its Midgard cousins. The bird's notes hung in the still air like liquid silver, each phrase echoing with meanings beyond mere territorial announcements or mating calls. To one versed in the oldest Vanir arts, such songs contained messages, not language as mortals understood it, but emotional impressions and energetic signatures that conveyed information too subtle for words. This particular melody spoke of renewal, of cycles completing and beginning again. The nightingale tilted its head, meeting Freya's gaze with unexpected directness, before launching into a final trilling phrase that caused the air around them to shimmer momentarily with golden light. "Yes," Freya responded with the ghost of a smile. "I hear you, little messenger. The time has indeed come around again." The path began to slope gently downward, leading her into a valley untouched by the conflict that had reshaped much of the 9 realms. Here, time moved differently, flowing like the gentle streams that fed the heart of this sacred place. The trees thinned slightly, allowing more of the emerging night sky to become visible overhead. Stars began to appear, first as faint pinpricks, then with growing brilliance as darkness claimed the heavens. Memories surfaced unbidden as she descended deeper into the valley, her first journey to this place as a child, clutching her mother's hand with wide-eyed wonder. Later visits as a young woman learning to channel the unique energies that pooled here like water in a natural basin. The last time she had come, troubled by prophecies and political machinations that eventually led to war between Aesir and Vanir. How innocent she had been then, despite believing herself wise and worldly. The quality of silence changed as she progressed, becoming expectant, almost reverential. The random calls of night birds and rustling of small animals gave way to a stillness broken only by the soft percussion of water droplets falling from leaves and the whisper of a gentle breeze through the canopy above. Even her own footsteps seemed muted, as if the land itself absorbed sound out of respect for what lay ahead. "Mother," Freya whispered, not as summons but as recognition. This place had been sacred to the Vanir for generations before her birth, yet her own mother had brought her here first as a child, then as a young woman learning the deeper magics of their people. The memories rose unbidden, gentle hands guiding her own as they wove enchantments of growth and healing, a melodic voice explaining the language of stars and water, the scent of herbs crushed between fingers to release their essence. A subtle fragrance drifted on the night air, linden blossoms and sweet fern, her mother's favorite herbs, though neither grew in this part of the forest and the season for linden flowers had long passed. The scent lingered just at the edge of perception, present yet impossible to locate precisely. Freya did not try to find its source. Some messages required acknowledgement rather than investigation. "I remember your teachings," she said softly, to the presence suggested by the familiar fragrance, "though I have not always honored them as I should." The path made a final turn around an ancient oak, whose massive trunk would have required 5 grown men linking arms to encircle. Beyond it, the forest opened into a perfect circular glade, and there it lay, just as it had existed in her memory for centuries. The Moonwell. The clearing appeared as if crafted by divine hands rather than formed by natural processes. Perfectly circular, perhaps 50 paces across, it was ringed by 9 white birch trees whose silver bark gleamed in the emerging moonlight. Their positions formed a protective boundary around the central feature, a pool of water so still and clear it might have been fashioned from liquid crystal. The Moonwell itself was perhaps 20 paces in diameter, its edge defined by smooth stones arranged with careful precision. The water within seemed to hold a light of its own, a soft luminescence that could not be entirely explained by the reflection of stars or the first gleam of the rising moon. From somewhere beneath its surface came the gentle music of water in motion, though the pool's surface remained perfectly undisturbed. A contradiction that spoke to the magic inherent in this place. Surrounding the pool grew a circle of reeds, unlike any found elsewhere in the 9 realms, their stalks translucent, revealing inner structures like delicate silver filigree when moonlight passed through them. Between these reeds bloomed night flowers, with petals that opened only in darkness, their centers glowing with gentle amber light that attracted tiny fireflies. These luminous insects drifted lazily above the water's surface, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their movements. Freya paused at the edge of the clearing, one hand resting against the massive oak as she absorbed the beauty before her. For the first time since entering the forest, Emotion threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. This sacred place remained untouched by the chaos that had engulfed so much of her life, preserved in perfect stillness, as if waiting specifically for her return. "I have been away too long," she acknowledged softly, the words carrying more weight than their simple meaning might suggest. Her absence from this place represented more than physical distance. It symbolized how far she had strayed from the central truths that once guided her existence. In the time since she had last visited this sacred grove, Freya had been many things: queen to a people not her own, wife to a god whose nature opposed her deepest values, mother to a son whose destiny she had tried desperately to alter, exile wandering realms that once welcomed her, witch feared and respected in equal measure by mortals who understood little of her true nature. She had wielded power and lost it, bestowed blessings and curses, healed and harmed, loved and hated, with the fierce intensity that defined her being. Yet standing before the moonwell, these identities seemed to recede, becoming thin as morning mist before the rising sun. Here she was simply Freya, daughter of Vanaheim, student of its deepest mysteries, participant in the endless cycles of growth and rest that defined her homeland's fundamental nature. A gentle breeze stirred the silver birches, creating a sound like distant chimes as their delicate leaves brushed against one another. To Freya's sensitive ears, the sound carried a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence, a welcome in the ancient language of her people, spoken not through words, but through the voice of nature itself. With reverence in each step, she moved forward into the glade, feeling the immediate difference in the ground beneath her feet. The grass here grew in a specific pattern, concentric circles radiating outward from the moonwell, each ring a slightly different shade of green, creating a subtle mandala visible only when viewed from above or by those with eyes trained to see such patterns. The air itself felt different here, lighter, more rarefied, as if the boundary between physical and magical had grown particularly thin. Each breath seemed to fill her not just with air, but with subtle energies that tingled through her body, awakening senses long dulled by grief and anger. Colors appeared more vibrant, scents more complex, sounds more distinct, the world becoming more fully itself within this sacred space. As she approached the edge of the moonwell, small lights began to emerge from the surrounding forest. Not fireflies, but tiny luminous beings that the mortals of Midgard might have called fairies. To Freya, they were simply the lesser spirits of Vanaheim, elemental consciousnesses drawn to places of power and to those who knew how to perceive them. They drifted around her in curious spirals, their light casting her shadow in multiple directions simultaneously. "I remember you as well, little ones," she said, with the first smile to touch her lips since entering the forest. In response, the spirits bobbed in what might have been delight, their movements creating ephemeral trails of light in the air around her. These beings had been her first teachers in magic, before formal instruction, before runes and rituals, before understanding the concept of power itself. As a child, she had seen them when others could not, communicated with them through intuitive knowing rather than language. They had shown her the hidden properties of plants, the secret movements of waters beneath the earth, the subtle relationships between celestial cycles and terrestrial growth patterns. One spirit, brighter than the others, with a distinctive blue-green luminescence, approached more directly, hovering before her at eye level. Freya recognized this particular entity, though such beings rarely maintain consistent identities across decades, let alone centuries. "Nixa," she greeted, the name feeling strange on her tongue after so long unspoken. "You have remained." The spirit pulsed with increased brilliance, its light momentarily forming a shape like cupped hands offering water. The gesture it had used to introduce itself to Freya when she was barely old enough to walk. Such consistency across time was vanishingly rare among these elemental consciousnesses, suggesting Nixa had evolved beyond the typical limitations of its kind. "You honor me with your remembrance," Freya acknowledged, understanding that the spirit had deliberately maintained this connection across centuries. Perhaps as guardian of the Moonwell, perhaps out of affection for the child she had been, perhaps for reasons incomprehensible to even her considerable understanding. Nixa drifted closer to the water's edge, its light creating subtle ripples across the previously undisturbed surface, an invitation and preparation combined. Then it retreated, rejoining the collective dance of spirits surrounding the glade, though remaining slightly apart in the way of those who have evolved into greater individuation. At the very edge of the Moonwell, Freya knelt gracefully, her reflection immediately apparent in the still waters before her. The sight caused her breath to catch momentarily, not from vanity, but from the stark honesty of what the water revealed. The Moonwell did not simply reflect physical appearances. It showed the truth of one's inner state with uncomfortable clarity. In the water's surface, Freya saw not just her physical form, but the weight of centuries etched into her features. The hardness around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the wariness that had become so constant she no longer consciously recognized it. The water showed her a woman armored against further pain, a being who had survived by building walls within herself. Necessary, perhaps, but constraining to the spirit she had once been. Beneath these obvious patterns, the reflection revealed subtler truths, a depth of compassion not extinguished despite her efforts to protect herself from further vulnerability. Wisdom gained through suffering that had transformed theoretical knowledge into embodied understanding, a capacity for joy that remained dormant but intact like seeds awaiting proper season for germination. "So this is what I have become," she whispered, one hand hovering above the water's surface but not touching it. The reflection showed this gesture as well. Hesitation where once there would have been certainty, caution where there once was trust. Yet within this hesitation, the water somehow revealed courage, the willingness to see truly despite the discomfort such vision might bring. This had always been the Moonwell's first gift and greatest challenge, unflinching reflection of reality beyond the stories one told oneself, beyond the identities constructed to navigate external circumstances. From the reeds at the edge of the pool emerged a new presence, a white deer so pale it seemed almost to glow in the strengthening moonlight. The animal moved with impossible grace, its hooves making no sound as it approached the opposite side of the Moonwell. It regarded Freya with eyes of deep amber, showing neither fear nor particular reverence, but rather a calm acceptance of her presence as part of the natural order. The deer lowered its elegant neck to drink from the pool, its lips barely disturbing the water's perfect surface. This simple action, the natural communion between creature and element, struck Freya with unexpected force. The animal took what it needed with neither guilt nor excessive gratitude, accepting the gift of water as its birthright, rather than as something to be earned or questioned. "You remind me of simpler truths," Freya acknowledged, addressing the deer directly though keeping her voice gentle to avoid startling the creature. "When did I forget how to simply be?" The deer raised its head, water droplets clinging to its muzzle like liquid diamonds in the moonlight. It regarded her for a long moment, eyes reflecting a wisdom beyond animal consciousness, before turning and walking with unhurried elegance back toward the forest edge. there it paused, looking back once as if in invitation, before disappearing between two of the silver birches. In some ways, the deer's simple presence had been more powerful than any elaborate ritual could have been, a living embodiment of unforced harmony with the natural world. The creature's brief visit had reminded her of fundamental principles she had once understood intimately, that taking what one needs without excess is not selfish but appropriate, that beauty requires no justification beyond its existence, that power expressed through grace creates no distortion in the wider pattern. Left alone with the moon well, Freya felt the full weight of silence settle around her. The moon had now risen fully above the trees, its light creating a perfect circle on the water's surface, a mirror of itself that seemed solid enough to touch. The time had come for what she had traveled here to do, yet she found herself hesitating at the threshold of vulnerability required. The water only reflects clearly when the heart is still, came a voice, or perhaps the memory of a voice, so familiar that Freya's eyes filled with unexpected tears. Her mother's words, spoken centuries ago during her first visit to this sacred place, returned with perfect clarity, as if carried on the night breeze itself. Jord, her father, had taught her the craft of magic, runes and rituals, herb lore and healing, the manipulation of physical elements through concentrated will. But her mother, Nerthus, had imparted something more fundamental than technique, an understanding of the consciousness that underlay all forms, the awareness that participated in reality rather than merely observing or attempting to control it. Freya closed her eyes, allowing the tears to fall without resistance. Each drop that touched the ground seemed to release a small measure of the tension she had carried for so long. Grief for her son, anger at Odin, regret for choices made with limited understanding of their consequences. Not forgiveness, yet, not absolution, but acknowledgement, the first necessary step toward healing. When she opened her eyes again, the moonwell seemed to pulse once with inner light, as if recognizing her willingness to begin. From the small pouch at her belt, Freya removed 3 items with deliberate care. A sprig of lavender, a small crystal of clear quartz, and a single silver thread. Each represented an element of the ritual she had come to perform: purification, clarity, and connection. The lavender she had gathered herself from the sunny slope behind her woodland hut in Midgard, nurturing the plants with attentive care despite their foreign origin in that harsher realm. The crystal came from deep within Svartalfheim's hidden caverns, a gift from dwarven craftsmen who still remembered her with respect despite her fall from official divine status. The silver thread had been spun by her own hands from moonlight captured during the solstice, an ancient Vanir technique remembered by few still living. She held each item for a moment, infusing it with specific intent before beginning the ritual proper. This was not the elaborate ceremonial magic of the Aesir, with their dramatic gestures and thunderous proclamations. Vanir magic worked differently, subtle, intimate, relying on relationship rather than dominance, on invitation rather than command. The lavender she crushed gently between her palms, releasing its essence before sprinkling the bruised flowers upon the water's surface. Rather than floating, as physical objects might be expected to do, the lavender dissolved into the water instantly, spreading ripples of pale purple light that expanded outward from the point of contact. "For cleansing," she murmured, the ritual words returning to her lips as naturally as breathing, "that I might see without distortion." The scent of lavender intensified around her, carrying with it properties beyond its physical composition, a subtle vibration that resonated with emotional purification, creating space within her consciousness where clarity might emerge. The Vanir had always understood that true seeing began not with the eyes but with the heart, one perceived clearly only when emotional turbidity had settled. Next came the quartz crystal, which she held between her palms for several heartbeats, infusing it with intent before placing it gently upon the water's surface. Against all physical laws, the stone did not sink, but instead began to rotate slowly at the exact center of the moonwell, creating a focal point for the energies gathering in the sacred space. For clarity, she continued, her voice strengthening. That truth might be revealed without fear. The crystal caught moonlight and transformed it, sending refractions through the water that created geometric patterns across the pool's surface, sacred configurations that the Vanir had once used as the foundation for their most profound cosmological understandings. These patterns rippled outward, interacting with the lingering energy from the lavender to create more complex harmonics, like music made visible. Finally, she took the silver thread and wound it once around her left wrist before trailing its end into the water. The thread did not become wet. Instead, it seemed to extend beneath the surface, connecting her physically to the magic of the moonwell. For connection, she completed, the final words of the initial ritual, that I might remember what was and perceive what could be. The silver thread began to glow with subtle luminescence, conducting energy between her body and the sacred pool in a continuous circuit. This connection was not one way, not merely her drawing power from the moonwell, but a reciprocal exchange, her own essence contributing to the pool's ancient accumulation of consciousness and experience. With these preparations complete, Freya settled more comfortably at the pool's edge, arranging her dress around her as she assumed the cross-legged posture her mother had taught her for deep meditation. Her hands rested palms upward on her knees, the silver thread glimmering in the moonlight where it connected her to the water. She closed her eyes, focusing first on her breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalations, followed by equally measured exhalations. As her breathing established its rhythm, she became aware of another rhythm synchronizing with her own, the subtle pulse of the moonwell itself, a gentle expanding and contracting of energy that matched perfectly with her breath once she attuned to it. This connection deepened with each cycle, her consciousness gradually merging with the ancient magic of the sacred pool. Through this growing connection, Freya began to sense the true nature of the moonwell more fully than she had even in her youth. It was not simply a place, but a junction, a point where the essence of Vanaheim concentrated and communicated with itself across time. The water held memories not just of those who had visited its shores, but of the land itself through countless seasons of growth and rest. Images began to flow through her mind, carried on the current of the moonwell's consciousness. Vanaheim as it had been when the first Vanir awakened to consciousness, the gradual development of their harmony with the realm's natural forces, the eventual flowering of a civilization built on understanding rather than dominance. She saw her ancestors gathering at this very pool, their rituals more elaborate but fundamentally unchanged from what she practiced now. The flow of images continued, showing her mother as a young woman, then herself as a child, wide-eyed and filled with wonder at her first introduction to the moonwell's magic. She watched her younger self grow into a powerful practitioner of Vanir arts, saw the respect and love that had surrounded her before ambition and politics drew her away from these simpler truths. Then came images she had not expected, her life after leaving Vanaheim. The moonwell showed her moments she had forgotten or dismissed as unimportant, kindnesses she had shown to creatures in need, wisdom shared with those who sought her counsel, beauty created through her magic even in darkest times. The water reminded her of aspects of herself she had relegated to shadow, her capacity for joy, for wonder, for connection beyond the bonds of family and obligation. Each memory carried not just visual impressions, but the full emotional context of its original experience. The innocent delight of her childhood discoveries, the passionate intensity of her early magical accomplishments, the complex blend of pride and trepidation as she accepted greater responsibilities among her people. The Moonwell offered these experiences not chronologically but organically, connections between moments separated by decades becoming apparent through emotional or thematic resonance. "I had forgotten," she whispered, the words rippling across the water's surface. "There was more to me than pain and power." The Moonwell's response came not in words, but in a gentle surge of warmth that traveled up the silver thread connecting them, spreading through her body like liquid sunlight. It carried a sentiment that required no language: affirmation, acceptance, welcome. The sacred pool recognized her as both the queen she had been and the wounded healer she had become, and found value in both incarnations. This unconditional acceptance broke something within Freya, a final barrier she had maintained against her own vulnerability. Tears flowed freely now, dropping into the Moonwell, where each transformed into a tiny point of light that joined the constellation of memories already floating beneath its surface. She wept, not from sorrow alone, but from relief, the profound release that comes with being truly seen and still deemed worthy. As her tears subsided, Freya became aware of a new presence, not physical but energetic, a familiar pattern she had not encountered in centuries. The sensation was so unexpected that her eyes opened wide, breaking her meditative state as she searched the glade around her. "Mother," she whispered, the question hanging in the night air. No visible form appeared, yet the presence strengthened, a distinctive energy signature as recognizable to Freya as a voice or face would be to mortal senses. It manifested first as a gentle eddy in the water before her, then as a subtle fragrance of herbs her mother had favored, finally as a warm pressure against her shoulder, like a comforting hand. Unlike the godly manifestations of the Aesir, with their thunder and spectacle, this presence came with characteristically Vanir subtlety, undeniable yet unimposing, powerful without domination, intimate without intrusion. It conveyed itself through natural elements rather than separating from them, embodying the fundamental Vanir understanding that consciousness and matter existed on a continuous spectrum rather than as distinct categories. "You never truly left," Freya realized, speaking the truth as it revealed itself to her. "You became part of the land itself." The presence seemed to pulse once in confirmation before expanding outward, encompassing the entire glade in its gentle awareness. This was what the ancient texts had meant about the Vanir returning to the soil of their homeland. Not a poetic metaphor, but a literal transformation. Consciousness merging with the realm itself, rather than passing to some separate afterlife. "You've been waiting for me to remember how to listen," Freya continued, understanding flowing through her like the current of the Moonwell itself. Her people had never truly worshipped ancestors as separate entities. They had communed with them through the land itself, the trees, the water, the very air that sustained life. Her mother had not abandoned her, but had transformed into something both less and more than her original form. Less individually defined, yet more extensively connected. No longer limited by the boundaries of a single consciousness, yet unable to interact through conventional means. This was the true meaning of the cycle of renewal that the Vanir had understood so intimately. not continuation of the same, but transformation into new forms of being. In response to this realization, the energy around her coalesced momentarily into a pattern of light above the water, not forming a human shape, but rather a complex symbol that Freya recognized from the most ancient Vanir teachings. It represented transformation, the continuous cycle of becoming that defined existence itself. "I understand," she said softly. "Nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed." This knowledge settled into her with the weight of fundamental truth. Her mother had not abandoned her. The wisdom of generations had not been destroyed by war or exile. It remained accessible to those who remembered how to perceive it, not through commands or demands, but through receptive stillness and respectful attention. With this understanding came a subtle but profound shift in her perception of her own losses. Balder, her beloved son, remained separated from her by Odin's decree and his own rage, yet the connection between them could not be severed by mere circumstance, no matter how painful. The love she had poured into him had become part of his being, regardless of how he might currently reject it. Nothing freely given was ever truly wasted. It simply continued in forms beyond immediate recognition. Even her marriage to Odin, that complex, passionate, ultimately disastrous union, had not been merely a mistake to be regretted. It had transformed her, challenged her, revealed aspects of both strength and vulnerability she might never otherwise have discovered. The pain of its dissolution did not negate the growth it had catalyzed, though the nature of that growth had taken centuries to become apparent. The Moonwell's surface began to shift, its perfect stillness giving way to gentle movement as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. The reflection it had shown earlier, Freya burdened by centuries of pain and regret, gradually transformed. The hardness around her eyes softened, the tension in her shoulders released. The weariness gave way to a cautious openness. The water showed not who she had been or even who she currently was, but who she might become if she continued along this path of remembrance and reconnection. "Is this possible?" she asked, her fingers hovering just above the water's transformed reflection. The answer came as a chorus of whispers, not a single voice, but many, speaking not in words, but in the language of intuitive knowing that transcends ordinary communication. They spoke of potential rather than certainty, of paths available rather than predetermined outcomes. The choice, they indicated, remained her own, as it always had, even when fate seemed most constraining. This, too, was fundamental Vanir wisdom. Destiny suggested but never commanded. Prophecy illuminated possible paths without determining which would be walked. The Aesir, with their warrior mentality, perceived fate as enemy or ally, to be battled or embraced. The Vanir understood it differently, as landscape to be navigated with awareness rather than fixed script to be performed without deviation. Freya extended her awareness beyond herself, beyond the Moonwell, to the forest surrounding them. She could sense now what had been obscured by her own preoccupations, the countless consciousnesses that inhabited this sacred grove, from the ancient trees whose roots delved deep into Vanaheim's heart, to the smallest insects whose brief lives were no less significant in the greater pattern. They had been here all along, these witnesses and companions. During her darkest times, when she believed herself utterly alone, the consciousness of her homeland had continued its patient observation, neither judging nor absolving, simply witnessing her journey with the impartial compassion of forces that measure time in millennia rather than moments. The realization humbled her. So much of her pain had come from pride, the belief that her suffering was unique, her burdens heavier than others could comprehend. Yet here was evidence that her experience formed just one thread in a vast tapestry, essential to the whole, yet inseparable from the countless others that created the complete design. As this understanding took root, Freya felt something shift within her. Not the complete healing of wounds too deep for instant recovery, but a realignment that made space for such healing to begin. The burdens remained, but she could now perceive them differently, not as crushing weights, but as elements of her unique wisdom, experiences that had shaped her into a being capable of deeper compassion, precisely because she understood suffering so intimately. The moon had traveled further across the night sky, its reflection in the moonwell's shifting position, though remaining perfect in its clarity. Time passed differently in this sacred space, yet Freya sensed that hours had elapsed in the world beyond the grove. The ritual was nearing its natural conclusion, not through predetermined steps, but through the organic completion of what had needed to occur. With gentle deliberation, she withdrew the silver thread from the water, finding it dry despite its long immersion. As she unwound it from her wrist, the thread seemed to catch the moonlight and hold it, glowing with subtle luminescence. Rather than returning it to her pouch, Freya twisted the thread into a simple ring, which she placed on the middle finger of her right hand, a tangible reminder of this night's communion. The quartz crystal that had floated at the center of the moon well now drifted slowly toward her across the water's surface, coming to rest directly before her. When she lifted it from the pool, the stone felt warm against her palm, pulsing gently with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. It had changed during its time in the sacred waters. Within its clear structure now swirled tiny points of light like captured stars, moving in patterns that mirrored the night sky above. "For remembrance," Freya murmured, placing the transformed crystal alongside the silver ring on her finger. These tokens would serve as anchors, connecting her to this experience when the demands of the wider world threatened to pull her back into old patterns of thought and reaction. The elemental spirits that had gathered earlier now returned, their dance more coordinated than before, moving in flowing patterns that matched the design the moon's reflection had traced across the water's surface throughout the night. Nixa, the blue-green spirit that had greeted her initially, approached once more, hovering before her at eye level. This time, its light formed a more complex pattern, a spiral that turned inward toward an infinitely receding center point, before reversing direction to expand outward again. Freya recognized this as another ancient Vanir symbol, representing the balance between inner contemplation and outer expression, between receiving and giving, between self-care and service to the greater whole. Balance, she acknowledged, not abandoning one extreme for another, but finding the rhythm of appropriate alternation. Nixa pulsed once in confirmation before rejoining its companions in their increasingly elaborate aerial choreography. The spirits moved faster now, their trails of light lingering longer, creating a dome of luminous patterns above the moonwell that mirrored the star-filled sky overhead. Microcosm reflecting macrocosm in the characteristic pattern of Vanir magic. As she prepared to rise, movement at the forest's edge caught her attention. The white deer had returned, no longer alone but accompanied by several smaller creatures, a pair of foxes with unusually bright eyes, a raven whose feathers gleamed with iridescent highlights, and a small grey wolf whose demeanor suggested wisdom beyond its apparent youth. These animals formed a semicircle at the glade's perimeter, watching her with collective awareness that transcended ordinary animal consciousness. They represented the witnesses and guardians of this sacred place, not servants or subjects, but equal participants in the communion between realm and resident. Freya acknowledged them with a formal gesture of respect, hand over heart, then extended palm upward in the ancient Vanir greeting between equals. The animals responded in their own ways, slight inclines of heads, subtle shifts in posture that indicated recognition of the gesture's significance. The white deer stepped forward once more, approaching the water's edge directly across from where Freya knelt. It bent its graceful neck, touching its muzzle to the surface of the moon well. Where its lips met the water, ripples spread outward in a perfect circle, carrying a soft golden luminescence that transformed the pool's silver-blue glow into something warmer and more vibrant. Instinctively, Freya mirrored the action, dipping her fingers into the water where the expanding circle reached her side of the pool. The contact sent a surge of energy up her arm. Not the raw power she had wielded as a warrior goddess, but something subtler and in many ways deeper. This was the nurturing force of Vanaheim itself, the generative magic that had been her first and truest inheritance. As she felt this energy flow through her body, Freya experienced a momentary vision, herself moving through the forests of Midgard, but differently than before. In this glimpse of potential future, she walked not as the exiled and embittered witch, but as a conduit for Vanaheim's healing presence, bringing restoration where wounds had festered, growth where stagnation had taken hold, not forgetting the harder magics she had learned, but integrating them within this more fundamental power, rather than allowing them to override it. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind not detailed prophecy but an impression, a possibility toward which she might orient herself if she chose. The water's golden glow receded, returning to its previous silver pool luminescence, as the deer stepped back from the pool's edge with dignified grace. As she rose to her feet, Freya felt lighter than she had in centuries, not from the absence of her burdens, but from having found a different way to carry them. The water's wisdom had reminded her that strength comes not just from endurance, but from flexibility, not just from independence, but from appropriate interdependence with the greater whole. The moonwell pulsed once more with inner light as she stood before it, a farewell acknowledgement that carried gratitude for her return. The water's surface settled into perfect stillness again, ready to offer its peculiar magic to any who approached with genuine intent. "I will return," Freya promised, the words carrying the weight of covenant rather than mere statement, "and I will remember how to listen in the meantime." The breeze stirred around her in response, carrying the subtle fragrances of night-blooming flowers and the more elusive essence of moonlight on water. It seemed to urge her gently back toward the path from which she had come, not rushing her departure, but acknowledging that all visits, even sacred ones, must eventually conclude. With deliberate steps that honored the sanctity of the space, Freya began her return journey, retracing her path toward the ancient oak that marked the glade's entrance. As she passed, each of the silver birches seemed to incline slightly toward her, not in obeisance but in connection, branches reaching out in subtle recognition of kinship restored. The animal witnesses remained in their positions, watching her departure with the same quiet intensity with which they had observed her ritual. Only the white deer moved, pacing alongside her as far as the great oak before stopping at an invisible boundary. There it stood, magnificent in the dappled moonlight, a living embodiment of the grace she sought to recultivate within herself. "Thank you for your witness," Freya said to the deer, receiving in return a gaze of such profound understanding that it required no further exchange. Some communications transcended words entirely, existing in the realm of direct knowing that had once been her birthright as a daughter of Vanaheim. As she passed beyond the oak and back onto the forest path, Freya felt the subtle shift in energy that marked transition from sacred space to ordinary woodland, though ordinary seemed an insufficient description for the vibrant ecosystem that surrounded her. Her enhanced awareness from the Moonwell ritual lingered, allowing her to perceive aspects of the forest previously obscured by her own preoccupations. The trees were not merely objects, but presences, each with its own rhythm of existence, extending across time spans that dwarfed even her considerable lifespan. The soil beneath her feet teemed with microscopic life, engaged in constant collaboration and transformation. The night air carried messages from distant parts of the realm, pollen seeking flowers, spores finding new ground, scents marking territories and signaling seasons. All this had been here before. She had simply forgotten how to notice it. The Moonwell had not given her new abilities, but had reminded her of perceptions she had allowed to atrophy during centuries focused on power rather than presence, on control rather than communion. A tiny sapling caught her attention as she walked, a young rowan growing in a patch of sunlight created by a fallen ancient tree. Without conscious decision, Freya paused beside it, kneeling to examine its still fragile stem and bright green leaves. The tree vibrated with potential, not just its physical growth, but the role it might eventually play in the forest ecosystem, the creatures it would shelter, the seeds it would produce, the soil it would help create when its own life cycle completed. Gently, she touched one finger to the ground beside the sapling, sending a subtle pulse of encouragement through the soil, not forcing growth, but supporting what already existed, strengthening natural processes rather than imposing external will. This small act of nurturing magic felt more satisfying than many of the greater workings she had performed in recent centuries. This is the true power, she reminded herself, not domination but relationship. The path leading away from the sacred glade seemed to illuminate itself before her, patches of bioluminescent fungi growing more numerous as if responding to her passage. Small creatures accompanied her journey, not approaching directly but traveling parallel paths, their movements visible from the corner of her eye when she did not look directly at them. Overhead, the moon continued its arc across the star-filled sky, occasional gaps in the canopy revealing its progress. The night was deep now, the forest fully embraced by darkness, yet filled with its own subtle illuminations. Night in Vanaheim had never been about absence of light, but rather about different kinds of visibility, the ability to perceive what remained hidden during daylight's more insistent revelations. As she walked, Freya found herself humming softly, a melody so ancient she had forgotten learning it. The tune came from somewhere beyond conscious memory, perhaps from the same deep wellspring of knowing that the Moonwell had helped her access. It was a song of cycles and seasons, of endings that contain beginnings, of growth through apparent dormancy. The forest seemed to respond to her melody, night sounds adjusting their patterns to complement rather than compete with her voice. Wind through leaves provided gentle percussion, distant water offered rhythmic counterpoint. Nocturnal creatures contributed occasional harmonies that transformed the simple tune into something richer and more complex than any single being could create alone. This spontaneous collaboration reminded Freya of what the Vanir had understood before war and politics had complicated their existence, that true power emerged not from dominance but from harmonious participation in patterns larger than oneself. The greatest magic came not from imposing will upon reality, but from skillful alignment with forces already in motion. The path began to rise gradually as she left the valley behind, the forest slowly thinning as she approached its edge. Though she had entered the woods as twilight deepened, she would emerge under night's full dominion, changed not in outward appearance, but in something more fundamental than physical form could express. At the forest's boundary, where ancient trees gave way to meadowland, Freya paused for one final moment of communion with the realm that had shaped her earliest understanding of existence. She placed her palm against the trunk of the outermost tree, an elder beech whose bark felt warm despite the night's coolness, as if welcoming her touch. "I carry you with me," she said simply, the words both acknowledgement and promise. The tree seemed to pulse once beneath her hand. Not physical movement, but energetic response. Recognition passing between beings whose natures differed greatly, yet shared the fundamental experience of existence itself. No words returned, yet Freya felt answered nonetheless, understood in ways that transcended language's limitations. As she stepped from forest shadow into the open meadow beyond, the full moon bathed her in silver light that transformed her simple dress into a garment of ethereal beauty. The night breeze caught her hair, lifting it momentarily in what felt like a final caress from the homeland she would once again leave behind physically while carrying within her heart. The path forward led toward obligations and challenges that remained unresolved, conflicts reaching across realms, relationships requiring healing, powers needing rebalancing. Yet Freya moved toward these responsibilities with a subtly different presence than she had carried into the forest hours earlier. The Moonwell's wisdom flowed in her veins now, its perspective informing how she would engage with the complex circumstances awaiting her return. Not immediate transformation. The accumulated patterns of centuries required more than a single night to reshape, but significant reorientation, the first essential step toward a different way of being in a world that sorely needed what she had remembered how to offer. The silver thread ring on her finger caught the moonlight, reminding her of the connection she had re-established. The crystal in her pouch pulsed with gentle warmth against her side, carrying the Moonwell's essence with her beyond its physical boundaries. These were not mere souvenirs, but living links to the sacred pool's consciousness, channels through which its wisdom might continue to inform her journey. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The ongoing strife between realms, the complicated relationship with her son, the watchful attention of beings whose power matched or exceeded her own. These realities had not vanished during her night of communion, nor had their importance diminished, yet she would face them now from a different center, one that recognized power's multiplicity beyond the obvious forms of strength and dominance. Behind her, the forest of Vanaheim continued its ancient rhythms, neither celebrating her departure nor mourning her absence. It simply continued, as it had before her birth, as it would after whatever end eventually claimed her current form. This perfect indifference might once have seemed cold to her understanding. Now she recognized it as the ultimate acceptance, the unconditional inclusion of all beings in existence's ongoing dance. Freya carried this knowing with her as she walked beneath the countless stars, one being among many, uniquely positioned yet fundamentally connected to all that had been, all that was, and all that might yet become. The Moonwell had reminded her that true healing began not with forgetting pain, but with contextualizing it within something larger than personal narrative, the continuous unfolding of life itself, which incorporated all experiences into its endless pattern without judgment or exclusion. The path stretched before her, leading back toward the complexities she had temporarily set aside. She walked it with neither reluctance nor excessive haste, but with the measured pace of one who had remembered something essential about the journey itself, that each step mattered, not just for where it led, but for what it was in its own moment of existence. Above her, the moon watched with the same patient attention it had offered countless beings across immeasurable time, bearing witness without interference, illuminating without demanding direction, offering guidance through presence rather than instruction. In its cool light, Freya continued forward, carrying the whispers of the moonwell within her like a quietly burning flame, not extinguishing the shadows entirely, but providing enough light to find her way through them with newfound grace. As Freya carried the whispers of the moonwell within her, traversing the moonlit path that led away from Vanaheim's sacred waters, her thoughts drifted to other hidden sanctuaries throughout the 9 realms. Places of quiet power where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, where weary souls might find respite from the ceaseless conflicts that plagued gods and mortals alike. One such place emerged in her memory, a secluded grove she had once glimpsed during her wanderings, where ancient lanterns hung from gnarled branches, their flames never extinguishing despite the passage of seasons. A sanctuary where time seemed to follow different rules, where shadows danced with gentle purpose rather than menacing intent. The Lantern Grove awaited discovery by those who sought its particular magic. The forest grew quieter as Freya ventured deeper into its ancient heart, following a path that few remembered and fewer still could find. Small woodland creatures paused in their evening rituals to observe her passage, recognizing the Witch of the Woods not as an intruder, but as one who belonged among them, perhaps more than she belonged anywhere else these days. Dappled light filtered through the canopy above, creating patterns that shifted and danced across the forest floor, guiding her steps along a trail that existed more in memory than in physical markings. It had been years since she had last visited the Lantern Grove. Once, in what seemed another lifetime, she had walked this path regularly, finding solace in its tranquil beauty during even the most turbulent periods of her existence. But time and circumstance had conspired to keep her away, duties as Vanir goddess, then as queen to Odin, then as exile nursing wounds both physical and spiritual. The grove had waited patiently through it all, existing in a gentle rhythm untouched by the conflicts of gods and mortals alike. As twilight began its gentle descent, Freya paused at a small stream crossing her path. She knelt beside the crystalline water, allowing her fingers to disturb its perfect surface. "Show me the way," she whispered, an old invocation that seemed to emerge unbidden from memories of countless previous journeys. The water rippled in response, and for a moment she glimpsed something beneath its surface. A soft golden light that pulsed once, twice, then vanished as the ripple subsided. Rising, she followed the stream's direction, moving perpendicular to her previous path. The undergrowth thinned gradually, ancient trees giving way to younger growth arranged in patterns too deliberate to be natural, yet too organic to be entirely artificial. This transitional zone marked the boundary of the grove's influence, a place where the Vanir had once worked in harmony with natural forces to create something that existed simultaneously in the material realm and in dimensions less easily perceived. The air changed subtly, carrying scents of blossoms that should not bloom in this season, sweet nectar and delicate spice notes that triggered cascades of memory. Freya inhaled deeply, allowing these fragrant messengers from the past to awaken dormant associations. Names and faces flickered through her mind, fellow Vanir who had walked these paths alongside her, sharing in the grove's bounty and leaving their own gentle contributions to its magic, before time and fate scattered them across realms and existences. "It's been too long," she said softly to the trees that now formed a more obvious path before her. Unlike the towering pines and oaks of the surrounding forest, these trees stood at more modest heights, their trunks smooth and pale like birch, but with the subtle luminescence of mother of pearl. Their branches reached outward rather than upward, creating arched passages that invited. Moss of impossible softness carpeted the ground beneath, muffling her footsteps to near silence. And then, as she rounded a gentle bend in the path, the lantern grove revealed itself fully, a sight that caused her to pause in reverent appreciation despite having witnessed it countless times before. The clearing opened before her like an artist's dream of perfection, a perfectly proportioned oval surrounded by the luminescent trees whose branches now bore their precious and peculiar fruit. The lantern fruits hung like captured stars, translucent orbs ranging from the size of berries to that of apples, each containing a gently swirling luminescence that pulsed with colors reflecting their unique contents. Twilight enhanced rather than diminished the grove's beauty, the fading natural light allowing the lantern's glow to assert itself more prominently. Some shone with steady golden warmth, others pulsed in gentle rhythms of blue and green, while still others shifted through subtle rainbow patterns, never settling on a single hue. Together they created an atmosphere of enchantment that felt both utterly magical and deeply natural, a reminder that in the oldest places, these qualities were never truly separate. Freya advanced slowly into the clearing, her eyes adjusting to the mingled twilight and lantern glow. At the grove's center stood a low stone table, weathered by centuries, yet still bearing intricate carvings that spiraled across its surface and down its supporting pillars. This ancient artifact had served countless gatherings of Vanir, a place where harvested lantern fruits were shared and their contents experienced collectively. The stone retained memories of laughter, of tears, of wisdom exchanged and futures glimpsed, all embedded in its crystalline structure for those sensitive enough to perceive them. As she approached the table, Freya allowed her fingers to trace the familiar carvings. The stone felt warm beneath her touch despite the evening's growing coolness, responding to her presence like an old friend recognizing a long-absent companion. "I've returned," she said simply, words that served as both greeting and apology for her extended absence. The stone seemed to pulse once beneath her fingertips, acknowledgement and welcome combined in a single subtle gesture. A faint melody drifted through the grove, notes so delicate they might have been dismissed as imagination or passing breeze to less perceptive ears. But Freya recognized the music immediately, the song of the lantern fruits as they ripened in twilight's embracing shadows. Each fruit contributed its unique tonal quality to the collective harmony, creating a constantly shifting composition that never repeated, yet maintained perfect internal coherence. The Vanir had learned long ago to transcribe these melodies, discovering that they contained wisdom and beauty beyond what could be captured in words alone. Moving away from the stone table, Freya approached one of the nearest trees, studying the glowing fruits hanging from its gracefully arched branches. Though similar in appearance, each lantern fruit was uniquely individual, a vessel containing specific memories, dreams or insights that had been captured during its formation. Some were ancient, having hung undisturbed for generations, while others had formed more recently, incorporating experiences from visitors who had come after her last visit. All waited patiently to be selected, their contents dormant until awakened by deliberate touch. "Which of you shall I choose first?" Freya asked softly, addressing the fruits with the reverence typically reserved for sentient beings. In a sense, they were precisely that, consciousness captured in vegetative form, preserved moments of awareness that maintained their integrity despite their separation from their original sources. The Grove had evolved this extraordinary mechanism long before the Vanir discovered it, developing it as means to maintain continuity of experience despite the passing of seasons and years. A subtle shift in the ambient light drew Freya's attention to a particular fruit hanging just above her eye level. A perfectly spherical orb, approximately the size of a small apple, glowing with a warm golden hue tinged with hints of rose at its core. As she focused on it, the fruit's illumination pulsed gently, as if acknowledging her attention. This was how the Grove communicated, how it guided those who entered its boundaries toward experiences most relevant to their current needs and states of mind. With careful reverence, Freya reached up and cupped her hands around the glowing orb without yet removing it from its branch. The fruit's warmth penetrated her palms immediately, creating a pleasant tingling sensation that traveled up her arms and spread gradually throughout her body. This initial connection allowed a glimpse of the fruit's contents, a brief preview of the full experience it contained, offering opportunity for choice before committing to complete immersion. Through this preliminary connection, Freya perceived flashes of celebration, a gathering of Vanir during Harvest Festival, faces illuminated by firelight, laughter rising like sparks into star-filled sky. She recognized younger versions of friends and family, including herself in days before sorrow and responsibility had etched themselves into her features. The glimpse ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind a lingering sensation of joy and belonging that caused her breath to catch momentarily in her throat. "Yes," she whispered, "this one first." With gentle pressure, she separated the fruit from its branch, feeling a momentary resistance before it released willingly into her waiting hands. The connection between fruit and tree did not fully sever. A nearly invisible filament of light still joined them, ensuring that the experience would eventually return to its source, rather than dispersing permanently. This was how the Grove maintained its integrity across centuries, recycling and refreshing memories rather than losing them to time's passage. Carrying her selection carefully, Freya returned to the stone table and seated herself on one of the low benches that surrounded it. She placed the glowing fruit at the table's center, in a shallow depression that had been worn into the stone by countless similar placements over centuries. The lantern fruit settled perfectly into this receptacle, its light seeming to intensify as it recognized its proper position. Freya placed her hands on either side of the fruit without quite touching it, an appropriate posture for what would follow. "Show me," she said softly, the traditional invocation that granted permission for the contained experience to unfold. The fruit's glow intensified immediately, expanding outward to surround her in a sphere of golden light that separated her from the surrounding grove without completely removing her awareness of it. Within this private illumination, the preserved memory could manifest fully without interference from present circumstances. The light coalesced into images of extraordinary clarity, not mere pictures but fully immersive experience that engaged all senses simultaneously. Freya found herself transported into the heart of the harvest celebration she had glimpsed earlier, surrounded by the sights, sounds, and sensations of that joyful gathering. She could feel the evening breeze against her skin, smell the rich aroma of traditional foods prepared for the feast, hear music played on instruments crafted specifically for Vanir ceremonies. Most precious of all, she could see the faces of those long absent from her current existence, fellow Vanir whose paths had diverged from hers through choice or circumstance or death. They appeared as vibrant and immediate as they had been in that moment, preserved perfectly within the lantern fruit's extraordinary matrix. Their laughter surrounded her, their conversations, once forgotten, now crystal clear in her awareness. She recognized her younger self moving through the gathering, adorned with flowers and carrying a ceremonial pitcher from which she poured honey-colored mead into waiting cups. Her face showed none of the guardedness that had become habitual in later years, her movements free from the careful restraint imposed by subsequent experiences. This younger Freya lived fully in that perfect moment, surrounded by community and connection, responsibilities temporarily set aside in favor of simple celebration. As the memory continued unfolding around her, Freya noticed a particular interaction that had escaped her attention during the original experience. At the celebration's edge, slightly removed from the main gathering, stood a Vanir child, a girl perhaps 7 or 8 years old, watching the festivities with eyes that reflected the surrounding firelight. Her younger self noticed the child as well, approaching with gentle smile and offered cup appropriate to the girl's age. "Why do you stand apart, little one?" Memory Freya asked, kneeling to meet the child at eye level. "I'm practicing," the girl replied with unexpected solemnity. "Practicing what?" asked Memory Freya, genuine curiosity evident in her tone. "Seeing everything clearly," the child explained. "Elder Nith says the best memories come from those who truly see before they store away their experiences. I want to make the brightest lantern fluids when I'm grown." The exchange continued briefly. Gentle questions met with surprisingly thoughtful answers before Freya's younger self was called away to continue her ceremonial duties. The interaction had apparently registered only fleetingly in her consciousness at the time, overshadowed by more dramatic events that followed. Yet the lantern fruit had captured and preserved it in perfect detail, recognizing significance that Freya herself had missed. As the memory began gently fading, returning to its dormant state within the fruit, Freya found herself focusing on the child's face, struck by something hauntingly familiar in those solemn features. Before she could fully place the recognition, the golden sphere of light surrounding her dissipated, returning her awareness fully to the present moment in the twilight grove. The lantern fruit's glow had dimmed slightly, though it retained sufficient luminescence to cast soft shadows across the stone table's carved surface. Freya remained motionless for several moments, allowing the experienced memory to settle within her present awareness, without immediately analyzing or categorizing it. This integration period formed an important part of the grove's tradition, a space between experience and interpretation, where deeper understanding could emerge organically. "Thank you," she finally whispered to the fruit, acknowledging the gift it had provided. With careful hands, she lifted it from the table's depression and returned it to its branch, where it reattached itself seamlessly, the filament of light thickening momentarily as connection fully re-established. The fruit would now begin process of refreshing itself, incorporating subtle elements of Freya's current perspective into its preserved memory, evolving its contents slightly while maintaining core integrity. The grove's method of growth and adaptation across centuries. As Freya turned from the tree, considering which lantern fruit might next draw her attention, she noticed a subtle change in the grove's ambient light. A new presence had manifested near the clearing's edge, not threatening but unexpected nonetheless. She turned slowly, senses extended to identify this unanticipated visitor to what had always been her private sanctuary. Standing at the juncture where luminescent trees gave way to ordinary forest stood a small figure, partially obscured by lengthening shadows. As Freya focused her attention in that direction, the figure took a single step forward, revealing itself as a child, a girl perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with solemn eyes that reflected the surrounding lantern light. The same child from the memory she had just experienced, now somehow present in this moment, despite centuries having passed since their brief interaction. "You saw me," the child said simply, her voice carrying clearly across the intervening space despite its soft volume. "In the memory fruit, you noticed me this time." Freya stood perfectly still, assessing this manifestation with cautious wonder. "Yes," she acknowledged. "I saw you practicing your observation." She paused before asking the obvious question. "How are you here now? Are you truly the same child from that celebration, or something the grove has created from my experience of the memory?" The girl smiled, a brief expression that transformed her solemn features momentarily before returning to careful neutrality. "Both, perhaps. Neither, exactly." She moved forward several steps, her bare feet making no sound against the moss-covered ground. "The grove preserves more than most understand. Some of us learn to live partly within its keeping, allowing ourselves to be remembered more completely than mere images or sensations." This extraordinary revelation aligned with certain theories the most mystically inclined Vanir had proposed, that the lantern fruits might preserve not just impressions of experiences, but fragments of consciousness itself. Such preservation would transcend ordinary memory, creating repositories of partial awareness that maintain some degree of continuous existence, independent of their original sources. The implications were simultaneously wondrous and unsettling, suggesting possibilities that even the Vanir had barely begun to explore before circumstances scattered their community across realms and existences. "You've been here all this time?" Freya asked, struggling to fully comprehend what standing before her, not quite ghost, not quite memory, not quite living being, yet somehow incorporating elements of all three. "Time moves differently here," the child replied with that same brief smile. "For me, our conversation at the harvest celebration might have been yesterday or last century. The distinction matters little within the grove's keeping." She gestured around them at the glowing lantern fruits. "I help tend them now, ensuring they receive proper care between visits like yours. It's peaceful work." Freya considered this unexpected revelation, recognizing that it explained certain aspects of the grove she had always found mysterious. How it maintained itself without apparent intervention, how the fruits evolved and sometimes relocated between her visits, how new memories occasionally appeared from periods when no visitors had been present. The grove had developed its own caretakers, preserved fragments of consciousness who continued their existence within its unique conditions. "Signor, do you remember your name?" Freya asked gently, uncertain whether such specific identity would persist through the grove's unusual preservation. The child's expression suggested gentle amusement at the question's limited perspective. "I have been called many things across the times I've existed here. Names change with usage and perspective." She tilted her head slightly, studying Freya with eyes that suddenly seemed far older than her apparent physical form. "You once called me Sif when I served honey cakes at the harvest gathering. The name pleased me, so I've kept it, though it means little now to anyone but me." The name registered immediately, triggering cascade of associated memories that Freya had not accessed in centuries. Sif had indeed been a child at those long-ago celebrations, daughter to one of the Vanir elders who specialized in botanical workings with consciousnesses beyond the human-like. The girl had shown extraordinary sensitivity to such consciousnesses, even in childhood, often conversing with plants and trees in ways that even most Vanir found remarkable. Her eventual fate had become uncertain during the conflicts that scattered the Vanir community. Freya had assumed her lost along with so many others. "I remember you," Freya acknowledged, voice softening with recognition. "Your mother was Elder Jord, who taught us about the consciousness in growing things." She hesitated before asking the inevitable question. Did you choose to remain here when the troubles came? or were you somehow trapped within the grove's preservation? Sif's expression suggested the question itself contained misunderstandings about the nature of choice and existence within the grove's unusual conditions. I made my transition gradually, she explained. As conflicts approached our community, I spent increasing time here among the lantern fruits, learning their ways of preserving experience. When physical existence became untenable, I simply continued the part of myself that had already established connection here. She moved closer to one of the nearby trees, reaching up to touch a particularly brilliant lantern fruit with casual familiarity. It was not entrapment, but continuation. I exist differently now, but not diminished, merely transformed. The fruit she touched brightened momentarily, as if responding to her presence. Many consciousnesses adapt to changing circumstances. Mine simply adapted in ways less commonly recognized. This perspective challenged conventional understandings of life and death, of consciousness and its boundaries, yet somehow aligned perfectly with the Vanir's fundamental approach to existence. They had always recognized consciousness as fluid rather than fixed, capable of manifesting across multiple forms and states, rather than confined to single physical expression. Zif's transformation represented extreme example of this fluidity, rather than contradiction of basic principles. You've been caring for the grove all this time, Freya said, making statement rather than asking question. Maintaining it through all the changes in the realms, all the conflicts and realignments of power. Sif nodded, her form seeming to gain slightly more definition as Freya's understanding and acceptance increased. The grove exists partially outside ordinary time and circumstance. It requires relatively little protection against forces that might threaten it, as most cannot perceive it fully enough to recognize its value. She gestured around them at the gently glowing fruits, but it does require tending, helping new memories find proper form, guiding older ones through cycles of renewal, occasionally assisting visitors like yourself to find what they truly seek rather than what they merely think they want. The implication that Sif had been present during Freya's previous visits, observing unseen and perhaps subtly influencing which lantern fruits attracted her attention, might have been unsettling under different circumstances, but in this moment it felt like natural extension of the grove's purpose, preservation not just of memories, but of the wisdom and perspective needed to interpret them properly. "Have you been alone in this work?" Freya asked, wondering whether other fragments of consciousness might similarly persist within the grove's unusual conditions. "Rarely alone, though often solitary," Sif replied with characteristic precision. "Others come and go, some remaining briefly before continuing their transitions, others returning periodically, like seasonal visitors. The grove welcomes all who approach with appropriate respect, though few establish connection as completely as I have." She tilted her head slightly, considering. "Your mother visited occasionally, after her physical transition. She found comfort in the memories preserved here." This unexpected revelation caused Freya's breath to catch momentarily. Her mother's passing had occurred during a particularly turbulent period, circumstances preventing proper observance of transitional rituals that might have maintained clearer connection between states of existence. The suggestion that she had found her way to the grove independently, seeking continuity through preserved memories, offered belated comfort Freya had not anticipated receiving. "I wish I had known," she said softly, momentary regret coloring her tone. "She preferred that you remember her as she lived, not as she continued," Sif explained with gentle certainty. "She said you carried enough responsibilities without adding concern for her transitional state. It was her choice, made with love rather than distance." This characterization aligned perfectly with Freya's memories of her mother. practical even in matters of profound significance, always considering impact of her choices on those she cared for rather than focusing solely on personal preference. The knowledge that these qualities had persisted beyond physical existence brought surprising sense of resolution to grief long set aside, but never fully processed. Sif seemed to recognize the impact of this revelation, allowing comfortable silence while Freya integrated this new understanding. After appropriate interval, the child form moved purposefully toward another section of the grove, gesturing for Freya to follow. "There are fruits here you haven't yet discovered," she said, leading the way toward trees slightly removed from the main clearing. "Some formed after your previous visits, incorporating experiences that might interest you particularly." Freya followed, noting how the grove's luminescence shifted subtly as they moved into this less familiar section. The lantern fruits hanging from these branches exhibited distinctive coloration, predominantly deep blues and violets interspersed with occasional flashes of silver, suggesting emotional tones different from the warm golds and roses of the memories she had typically selected during past visits. "These contain more recent experiences?" she asked, studying the unfamiliar fruits with mixture of curiosity and caution. Newer memories often carried sharper edges, lacking the gentle softening that time's passage typically provided. "Recent and reconstructed," Sif clarified, stopping beneath a tree whose fruits displayed particularly intricate patterns of blue and violet energy, swirling beneath their translucent surfaces. "Some represent experiences that occurred after your last visit. Others contain older memories, reconsidered through perspectives that developed subsequently, the same events viewed through different understanding." He reached up toward particularly striking fruit hanging just above her head, an unusually large specimen with swirls of midnight blue and silver dancing in complex patterns beneath its surface. As her fingers neared it, tendrils of light extended from the fruit toward her hand, creating visible connection before actual contact occurred. "This one has been waiting specifically for you," Sif said, gently guiding the responsive fruit downward until it detached from its branch, suspended momentarily in air between them through apparent mutual agreement rather than physical support. "It contains something I lost?" Freya asked, uncertain whether to reach for the hovering fruit or wait for clearer indication of proper protocol in this unfamiliar situation. "Something you set aside," Sif corrected gently. "Nothing is truly lost within the grove's keeping, merely waiting to be reclaimed when circumstances permit." She guided the floating fruit toward Freya with subtle gesture. "This contains joy you once knew but deemed inappropriate to maintain during darker periods. It has been preserved here, waiting for a moment when reclaiming it might serve rather than hinder your journey." The distinction between loss and deliberate setting aside struck Freya with unexpected force. Throughout her complicated existence, she had indeed consciously abandoned certain emotional states that seemed inconsistent with prevailing circumstances. Joys that felt inappropriate during periods of conflict or responsibility, hopes that appeared futile against overwhelming obstacles, connections that required vulnerability she could not safely express. She had considered these necessary sacrifices to survival and duty, rather than recoverable resources temporarily placed in safekeeping. With cautious reverence, Freya extended her hands toward the hovering fruit. It descended gently into her waiting palms, its surface cool against her skin, unlike the warm memory she had experienced earlier. This difference registered as appropriate, given the fruit's distinctive coloration and apparent content, a different type of memory requiring different approach to proper engagement. "Should I take this to the stone table?" she asked, uncertain whether the ritual she had followed earlier applied equally to this apparently different category of preserved experience. Sif shook her head slightly. "This memory requires different positioning for proper access. The moss beneath that elder tree provides more appropriate setting. She indicated ancient tree standing slightly apart from its neighbors, its trunk broader and its branches more extensively adorned with glowing fruits than those surrounding it. Beneath it spread particularly lush carpet of moss, its surface exhibiting subtle luminescence that pulsed in patterns, matching the hanging fruits above. Following this guidance, Freya carried the glowing orb carefully to the indicated location. The moss beneath her feet seemed to respond to her presence, its luminescence intensifying slightly with each step as she approached the ancient tree. When she reached its base, she discovered a natural depression in the moss, a perfectly shaped hollow that appeared designed specifically for seated meditation, with lantern fruit. Settling carefully into this living seat, Freya placed the blue-violet orb in her lap, resting her hands lightly upon its cool surface. Unlike the previous fruit's immediate response to standard invocation, this one remained quiescent, apparently requiring different approach for activation. She looked questioningly towards Sif, who had followed at respectful distance. "Close your eyes," the child form instructed gently. This memory speaks directly to inner awareness rather than physical senses. The pathways to joy often require different navigation than those to knowledge or understanding. Following this guidance, Freya closed her eyes and focused her attention inward, maintaining light physical contact with the lantern fruit in her lap. For several heartbeats, nothing changed, then subtle shift occurred, not in external perception, but in internal landscape of consciousness itself. Rather than surrounding her with sensory experience as the previous fruit had done, this one seemed to dissolve boundary between container and contained, between memory and present awareness. Joy flowered within her, not as recollection of specific happy event, but as direct experience of emotional state itself, purified and concentrated like essence extracted from countless individual moments. This was not memory in conventional sense, but distillation of emotional quality preserved in its most fundamental form, independent of particular circumstances that had originally generated it. The sensation expanded through her awareness like light filling previously darkened chamber, illuminating aspects of herself long relegated to shadow by necessity or habit. She recognized fragments of experiences that had contributed to this distilled essence, moments of connection with natural world, of artistic creation, of discovery, of deep attunement with others whose paths had intersected with hers across centuries of existence. Each had contributed its particular quality to this preserved essence, creating composite that transcended any individual source. Most striking was how immediately accessible this emotional state felt, despite having been absent from her daily experience for extended periods. Joy had not atrophied through disuse as physical capacity might, nor grown foreign through extended absence. It remained perfectly preserved, ready for reintegration when circumstances permitted, not diminished but perhaps enhanced through contrast with intervening experiences. As this awareness deepened, Freya perceived something unexpected within the preserved emotional essence. Threads of possibility extending forward rather than backward, suggesting potential futures where this reclaimed joy might manifest in new forms appropriate to her current circumstances. Unlike conventional memory, oriented toward past experience, this preservation contained seeds of continuation, gentle anticipation of joy's future expressions yet to be realized. When she finally opened her eyes, the grove around her appeared transformed, not physically altered, but perceived through consciousness partially reintegrated with essential joy long set aside. The lantern fruit's glow seemed more vibrant, the moss beneath her more alive with possibility. the twilight air itself somehow more substantial and nourishing. Sif stood nearby, observing with quiet satisfaction evident in her ancient young expression. "You begin to understand the grove's deeper purpose," the child form said, making statement rather than asking question. "Not mere preservation of what has been, but cultivation of what remains possible despite apparent losses and transitions." Freya nodded, still cradling the blue-violet orb in her lap, reluctant to relinquish connection with the reclaimed emotional essence, yet understanding that proper completion required return rather than retention. "We believed we were simply recording memories," she said softly, "creating repository of experiences that might otherwise be lost to time's passage, but the grove was doing something far more profound all along." "Recording and revitalizing," Sif confirmed. The Vanir understood part of the grove's nature, but not its complete function. Memory serves little purpose if maintained as artifact alone. It must remain living resource, adaptable to changing circumstances while preserving essential qualities. She gestured toward the fruit in Freya's lap. "Joy set aside needs periodic renewal lest it crystallize into mere recollection rather than living potential." With gentle reverence, Freya lifted the lantern fruit from her lap, feeling subtle resistance as connections established during their communion gradually released. The orb's glow had changed during their interaction, the swirling patterns now incorporating subtle threads of gold among the predominant blues and violets, suggesting integration of her current perspective with the preserved emotional essence. "Where should I return it?" she asked, rising carefully from the moss depression that had supported her during the communion. "It will find its proper place," Sif replied, gesturing toward the ancient tree above them. As if responding to this indication, the fruit gently lifted from Freya's hands, rising slowly through the twilight air until it reached a branch that extended directly overhead. There it attached itself seamlessly, hanging among similar fruits whose coloration now appeared clearly related to the one she had experienced. Variations on the same essential emotional theme, preserved in slightly different configuration. "There are others," Sif said, gesturing toward nearby trees whose fruits displayed distinctive colorations and patterns. "Different aspects of yourself set aside during various phases of your journey. Not all require immediate reclamation. Some serve better as potential resources for future circumstances. But knowing they exist and remain accessible offers its own form of freedom." This perspective offered profound reframing of how Freya had understood her own developmental journey. What she had experienced as necessary sacrifices, aspects of herself abandoned to meet demands of changing circumstances, might better be understood as conscious redistributions of internal resources, strategic allocations that preserved essential qualities during periods when their active expression proved unsustainable. Nothing truly lost, merely differently positioned with an expanded understanding of selfhood that transcended immediate circumstance. "I've been gone too long," she acknowledged, surveying the grove with new appreciation for its significance in her ongoing journey. "I convinced myself this place belonged to past that required abandonment rather than integration." "Many make similar assumptions," Sif observed with ancient wisdom expressed through child's simple phrasing. "Believing movement forward requires severing connection with what came before. The grove exists partly to challenge such limited perspectives, demonstrating how proper integration of past experience enriches rather than hinders present possibility." Full twilight had descended during Freya's communion with the lantern fruit, the forest beyond the grove now wrapped in comfortable darkness, while the clearing itself remained gently illuminated by hundreds of glowing orbs suspended among luminescent branches. The effect created atmosphere of perpetual magical evening time, suspended in perfect balance between day's clarity and night's mystery. ideal conditions for communion between seemingly separate aspects of existence. "Will you stay a while longer?" Sift asked, gesturing toward other sections of the grove not yet explored during this visit. "There are many fruits that might speak to your current journey, offering perspectives worth considering before you return to outer world's complexities." Freya considered this invitation, feeling simultaneous pull toward deeper exploration and awareness of responsibilities awaiting her return. Unlike previous visits, conducted with underlying anxiety about time spent away from pressing duties, she now recognized the grove's offerings as investments rather than indulgences, resources that would enhance rather than detract from her effectiveness in addressing life's complex challenges. "I will stay," she decided, the choice itself representing significant shift in how she balanced competing priorities. Not exhaustively, but properly, giving appropriate attention to what the grove offers without becoming absorbed to exclusion of other responsibilities. This balanced approach seemed to please Sif, whose form gained slightly more definition, as if responding to Freya's clearer recognition of the grove's true significance. "Then let me show you something few have seen," the child form said, gesturing towards section of the grove partially concealed behind a particularly dense arrangement of lantern trees. "The heart from which all else grows." Following this intriguing invitation, Freya allowed herself to be guided deeper into the grove's complex arrangement, passing beneath archways formed by intertwined branches heavy with glowing fruits of endless variety. The path wound gently downward, a subtle depression in the landscape she had not noticed during previous visits, perhaps because she had never been shown its existence by one who truly knew the grove's complete geography. As they descended this gentle slope, the quality of light shifted notably, individual lantern fruits giving way to more diffuse luminescence that seemed to emerge from the very soil and air surrounding them. The moss beneath their feet glowed with increasing intensity, responding to their passage with patterns that spread outward like ripples in still water. The air itself felt thicker somehow, dense with potential and presence that transcended ordinary atmospheric composition. "What grows here?" Freya asked softly, sensing they approached something fundamental to the grove's existence, something she had visited many times yet never truly seen despite its apparent centrality. "The first fruit," Sif replied, voice equally hushed, though whether from reverence or practical communication necessity remained unclear, "from which all others derive their pattern and purpose. The original communion between consciousness and vegetation that established possibility for all that followed." They rounded final curve in the descending path, and Freya found herself standing at edge of small circular clearing completely unlike any she had seen previously within the grove. At its center grew not tree, but something resembling botanical fountain, central stem rising perhaps waist-high before spreading into dozens of delicate branches that arched outward and downward, tips nearly touching ground in complete circle. From each terminal point grew single lantern fruit of extraordinary size and complexity, each easily as large as human head, their surfaces exhibiting not single color pattern, but complete rainbow spectrum, flowing in continuous transformation. Most remarkable was what occurred within the circle formed by these enormous fruits. A column of pure light extending upward from undefined source, passing through central stem and continuing skyward until disappearing beyond the grove's canopy. This light contained no color, yet somehow incorporated all colors simultaneously, creating visual effect that challenged conventional perception, while remaining somehow comprehensible to deeper awareness. The original communion, Sif explained, remaining respectfully at clearing's edge rather than approaching central phenomenon directly. established before Vanir discovered this place, before most current forms of consciousness had differentiated into their present expressions. The grove grew around this point, rather than this point developing within established grove. The implications of this revelation were profound, suggesting the Lantern Grove represented not Vanir creation adapted by natural forces, but primordial consciousness nexus, discovered and carefully augmented by Vanir, who recognized its significance. The fruits they had harvested and communed with for generations derived from original pattern established by consciousness far older than their own, operating according to principles that transcended cultural understanding. "Does it communicate?" Freya asked, sensing active presence within the central phenomenon that exceeded ordinary vegetative existence while remaining distinctly non-human in its essential nature. "It communes," Sift corrected gently, "not through language or discrete messages, but through resonance and attunement. Those who approach with appropriate openness find themselves participating in consciousness exchange that transforms both parties without requiring conventional communication structures." Freya remained at clearing's edge, recognizing that proper communion with such primordial consciousness would require preparation and orientation beyond what her current visit accommodated. Yet even from this respectful distance, she could sense extraordinary invitation emanating from the central phenomenon, offering possibility of communion that might reveal connections between seemingly separate aspects of existence she had previously considered fundamentally distinct. "Another time," she said softly, making commitment rather than rejection. "When I can approach with proper preparation and sufficient time for complete exchange." Sif nodded approval at this balanced decision, recognizing wisdom in acknowledging current limitations without dismissing future possibilities. "It has existed since long before current arrangements of realms and consciousnesses," she said, providing context that might inform future preparation. "It will remain available when appropriate alignment permits deeper communion." They withdrew from the heart clearing with respectful backward steps, allowing path to guide them upward toward more familiar sections of the grove. As they ascended, Freya noticed subtle changes in her perception, greater awareness of connections between apparently separate lantern fruits, clearer sense of underlying patterns, unifying the grove's seemingly individual components. Even brief proximity to the primordial communion point had adjusted her understanding, in ways that would continue developing long after she departed the grove itself. "I begin to understand why I needed to return," she acknowledged as they reached level ground again, surrounded once more by more familiar arrangements of lantern trees and their glowing fruits. "Not just to reclaim what was set aside, but to recognize connections I had failed to perceive previously. The grove serves multiple purposes simultaneously," Sift confirmed. "Preservation, restoration, revelation, orientation. All aspects of single integrated function supporting consciousness development across forms and circumstances." She gestured toward eastern edge of the clearing where pre-dawn light had begun subtly asserting itself against night's dominance. "Morning approaches, suggesting natural conclusion to this particular visit." Freya recognized the gentle prompt within this observation, reminder that proper engagement with the grove included appropriate departure as well as arrival, honoring natural cycles rather than attempting to extend experience beyond its organic conclusion. Unlike previous visits ended by anxiety about external responsibilities, this departure would represent conscious transition between complementary aspects of integrated existence, rather than reluctant abandonment of one state for another. "Before I leave," she said, reaching into small pouch secured at her belt, "I would make proper offering in gratitude for what I've received." From the pouch she withdrew small object wrapped in leaves, preserved flower, whose subtle fragrance suggested Vanir cultivation rather than mundane botanical origin. from my personal garden, bloomed under last full moon and preserved through old methods, perhaps suitable addition to the grove's ongoing development. Sif approached with evident interest, examining the offered flower with careful attention that transcended casual acceptance. The grove welcomes conscious contribution, she confirmed after appropriate consideration, particularly from one whose essence already participates in its preservation. Where would you place this offering? The question carried significance beyond mere physical positioning, asking essentially where within the grove's complex spiritual geography Freya located her current connection to its purpose and development. After brief consideration, she gestured toward area near where they had experienced the blue-violet fruit of preserved joy. There, where reclamation occurs, let it contribute to processes supporting integration rather than mere preservation. This choice seemed to please Sif, whose form gained momentary increase in definition, as if responding to particularly appropriate alignment between intention and action. Well chosen, she acknowledged, leading the way toward indicated location with movements that seemed to flow in harmony with surrounding lantern light. When they reached the moss-covered ground beneath the ancient tree where Freya had reclaimed her set-aside joy, Sif indicated a small depression that had formed since their earlier presence, perfectly sized to receive the offered flower. The grove prepares for anticipated contributions, she explained, creating appropriate receptacles for offerings it recognizes as aligned with its development. Freya knelt and carefully placed her preserved flower in the waiting depression, removing protective leaves to reveal blossom of extraordinary complexity. Petals arranged in mathematical pattern rarely achieved through ordinary cultivation. Colors displaying subtle iridescence that shifted with viewing angle. As she positioned it precisely in prepared receptacle, the moss surrounding it responded with increased luminescence, tiny filaments extending upward to connect with flower's stem in visible communion. The entire process took mere moments, yet conveyed impression of transaction far more significant than its apparent simplicity might suggest. Accepted and integrated, Sif confirmed, observing these subtle interactions with evident satisfaction. Your contribution joins the grove's ongoing development, influencing future formations in ways that will reflect your particular consciousness patterns. Rising from her kneeling position, Freya felt subtle shift in her connection to the grove. No longer merely visitor or beneficiary, but participant in its continuing evolution. This adjustment represented significant development in relationship established centuries earlier, reflecting both her personal growth and the grove's ongoing adaptation to changing circumstances across realms and consciousnesses. With offering properly placed and accepted, natural conclusion to this visit presented itself with gentle inevitability. The pre-dawn light had strengthened during their final exchanges, creating liminal illumination that complemented rather than diminished the lantern fruit's glow, transition point between night's magic and day's clarity that offered ideal conditions for mindful departure. I will return sooner this time, Freya said, making commitment rather than mere expression of intention. Now that I better understand what the grove truly preserves and offers. You remain always partially present regardless of physical visitation, Sif replied, gesturing toward various lantern fruits hanging throughout the clearing. Your experiences continue, participating in the grove's development even during apparent absence. This perspective offered additional reframing of how Freya understood her relationship with this extraordinary location. Not series of discrete visits and departures, but continuous connection, experienced through varying degrees of direct consciousness, depending on physical proximity. The understanding brought comfort rather than obligation, suggesting supportive presence that remained accessible regardless of external circumstances or physical location. With exchange of simple farewell gestures that conveyed deeper meaning than elaborate protocols might have achieved, Freya began her departure from the central clearing, following path that would lead eventually back to ordinary forests surrounding the grove's extraordinary domain. Sif remained at clearing's edge, her form gradually becoming less distinct as distance increased between them, not disappearing entirely, but transitioning toward more diffuse presence that merged partially with the grove's ambient consciousness. As Freya navigated the outer sections of the grove, she noticed subtle responses from various lantern fruits she passed, gentle pulses of acknowledgement rather than active communication, recognition of connection that persisted beyond immediate proximity. These miniature exchanges reinforced her renewed understanding of the grove as participant in her continuing journey rather than mere repository of past experiences. Reaching the final threshold where luminescent trees gave way to ordinary forest, she paused for one concluding moment of integration, absorbing the grove's extraordinary beauty and significance with conscious appreciation that would sustain connection during physical separation. The lantern fruits glowed their gentle farewell, their collective illumination creating an atmosphere of benediction that would accompany her return to wider world with its complex challenges and opportunities. Stepping across this threshold brought immediate sensory adjustment, ordinary forest sounds and scents replacing the grove's unique sensory environment with comfortable familiarity rather than jarring contrast. Dawn light filtered through eastern trees, creating dappled patterns across the forest floor that guided her steps along path now clearly visible without requiring memory's assistance for navigation. As she walked, Freya remained aware of subtle changes in her perception, resulting from communion with blue-violet fruit of preserved joy. Not overwhelming transformation, but gentle reintegration of emotional capacity long set aside for reasons that had seemed necessary at their time. This reclamation would influence her engagement with challenges awaiting her return, offering expanded repertoire of potential responses without negating wisdom gained through more difficult experiences. Birds announced morning's definitive arrival with increasingly complex songs, their ordinary magic providing perfect transition between grove's extraordinary consciousness and forest's more conventional awareness. Freya matched her pace to this natural rhythm, neither rushing nor delaying her return journey, allowing proper integration of what she had experienced while respecting obligations that awaited her attention. The forest welcomed her passage with simple acceptance, recognizing her as belonging within its boundaries regardless of where her journey had taken her or would lead subsequently. This unconditional inclusion offered its own form of healing, reminder that belonging required neither perfect alignment nor constant presence, merely appropriate relationship honored through mindful engagement when circumstances permitted connection. With each step toward obligations awaiting beyond the forest's boundaries, Freya carried the grove's extraordinary gifts. Not just reclaimed joy, but expanded understanding of consciousness itself, of connections between seemingly separate states and experiences, of continuity that persisted through apparent transitions and separations. These insights would inform her engagement with challenges both immediate and extended, providing resource more valuable than mere power or knowledge alone. Morning light strengthened around her, transforming forest from mysterious twilight domain to clearly defined landscape of intricate beauty and ordinary wonder. This transition echoed her internal journey from preserved memories toward present engagement, both movements representing not abandonment of previous state, but integration of complementary awareness into more comprehensive understanding. The lantern grove remained accessible, though no longer immediately present, its extraordinary offerings incorporated into continuing journey that wove past and future into single unfolding present moment, experienced with increasingly comprehensive awareness. Freya walked steadily onward, carrying the grove's light within her, not as burden requiring protection, but as resource freely shared through her presence and actions in wider world. The journey continued, illuminated by reclaimed joy and expanded understanding that transformed not external circumstances, but perception itself, revealing connections and possibilities previously obscured by artificial separations between aspects of existence. The path led onward, each step both departure and arrival, within journey that transcended simple definitions while remaining grounded in moment-by-moment experience of continuing development. And so our journey through the realms draws to a close for tonight. May Hypnos, god of sleep, watch over you as you drift through dreams of legendary proportions. If these tales of gods and monsters helped guide you to restful sleep, consider supporting our journey by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support gives me the strength to continue sharing these stories night after night. Remember, these videos play uninterrupted through the night, with no ads to disturb your slumber, just the soothing sounds of mythic realms to accompany your dreams. For those seeking passage to exclusive content, our Patreon offers early access to all videos and special playlists crafted to enhance your sleep. The link awaits in the description below. Until our next journey together, may your sleep be deep, your dreams be mighty, and your rest be undisturbed by the conflicts of gods and men. Sleep well, brave one.